So now that we've looked at the sympathetic nervous system, let's delve into the parasympathetic division, which in a lot of cases has the opposite effect of the sympathetic system, especially if you have dual innervation of a particular organ system. And as we've seen with the heart, whereas the sympathetic division will typically increase heart rate, increase force of contraction, the parasympathetic division will have the opposite effect. So we also have some differences in the organization of these systems as well. So for example, we'll see that the circuit diagrams, if you will, are a little bit different. So let's actually have a look here. So what we're going to have is we're going to have the main nerves that we're going to be dealing with will be cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. And these will be arising from brainstem areas. And then we're going to have sacral nerves 2 through 4. So for this reason, this parasympathetic division is often called the craniosacral division. And so these preganglionic fibers from the parasympathetic division will arise from these areas. So we're going to have the brainstem nuclei, once again, associated with cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, and also sacral nerves 2 through 4. So S2, 3, and 4. And one of the first things we'll notice is how long the preganglionic fibers are. What we will notice is that a lot of these preganglionic fibers will have to travel a fairly good distance to get to their targets. And what we'll see is that the ganglia themselves are either, in the case of the cranial nerves, going to be located in some kind of ganglion that's going to control some of these visceral structures like the pupils of the eyes, for example, the smooth muscle in the pupils of the eyes, lacrimal glands, salivary glands, and so forth. Their ganglia will be located in regions in the head. And then we're going to have most of the other ganglia going to be what we call intramural ganglia. So these will actually be located within the walls of the organs themselves. So we can see that basically we have these ganglia that are either in or near the organs that they're supplying. The other thing that we will notice about the craniosacral division is, and it's not really shown on this chart, but one of the things that we will see is a much less degree of divergence from the preganglionic fibers to the postganglionic fibers. So in other words, you'll have maybe a divergence of around 6. So for every preganglionic fiber, it may innervate up to 6 ganglionic neurons. So that the degree of divergence will be quite a bit less because we're not basically alarming the system to arousal, but we're actually going to be doing some very focused things like digestion. So now we're going to be shifting the focus away from the general alarm to things like digestion, defecation. As we've said before, this is the anabolic nervous system as well, because this is where you have time to take the nutrients that you absorb, use them to produce new structures and new things. And so this is where, as we said, rest and digest, this is where we're going to be able to sort of rebuild after we've had an episode of an intense stimulation that would, say, bring on sympathetic stimulation. So once again, we'll see quite a bit less divergence from our preganglionic to ganglionic neurons, and as opposed to the sympathetic division, where we'll see about 1 to 32 degree of divergence. And here it's about 1 to 6. Now let's talk about some of the functions of the parasympathetic nervous system. Obviously, we're going to decrease the metabolic rate. We will not need to release our energy stores simply because we're going to be resting. So our heart rate and blood pressure will decrease because we don't need to be pumping massive amounts of blood to meet any particular demands. At this point, we're going to increase salivary and digestive gland secretion, and we're also going to divert blood flow away from the skeletal muscles now back towards the digestive tract. So now we're going to increase blood flow through the digestive tract, and will also increase motility of the digestive tract, smooth muscle movement through the digestive tract, and so forth. And finally, we can take care of business if we've been unable to do it during some intense stimulation. Well, now we can turn our attention to basic functions like urination and defecation. We'll also see things, for example, like the pupils of our eyes. They will constrict. And this will bring our focus close to what we're doing. So instead of having our focus off in the distance and increased mental awareness, by constricting the pupils of our eyes, that brings our focus in closer. And we can then pay attention to what's in our immediate vicinity. Whereas in sympathetic division, our pupils will actually dilate so that we can take in more light and see what's around and be able to assess our environment a little bit better. So these are the kinds of differences that we're going to see between the two divisions of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the third division of the autonomic nervous system, and we're only going to touch on it briefly here because we'll get to it in a lot more detail when we get to digestion. But the enteric nervous system is the third division, and this we'll find throughout the smooth muscle walls of the digestive system. And it is a standalone system. And while it can work completely independently, it does have top-down influences from the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. And it's also going to be quite a complex system in and of itself. So it's going to have millions of neurons, and it's going to have as many neurons as are in the spinal cord and also as many neurotransmitters are in the brain. And it used to be thought, the ancient Chinese thought that the stomach was the seat of consciousness. And perhaps this is why, because we do actually have quite a bit of neural stimulation in this area. This enteric nervous system is quite capable of operating on its own, and it will coordinate visceral reflexes. So this will coordinate the movements of things through, say, the stomach to the small intestine, and then from there into the large intestine, and so forth. All right, now let's talk a little bit more about the sympathetic division. As we've said before, our preganglionic neurons are located in those lateral gray horns where our visceral motor nuclei are, and those are located through spinal segments T1 through L2. And remember, our ganglionic neurons, that are going to be in those sympathetic chain ganglia, are going to be near the vertebral column, and in some cases they're going to be in the collateral ganglia that we've already discussed. So let's have a quick look. We've already talked about our ganglia, our sympathetic chain ganglia, which run the length of the spinal cord, our collateral ganglia, which will include the celiac ganglion, the superior and inferior mesenteric ganglia, and the adrenal medulla itself. So let's look at the sympathetic chain ganglia. These are going to be on both sides of the vertebral column, and they will control visceral effectors that are within the body wall, the thoracic cavity, within the head and the limbs. And so if we look at the circuit diagram here, now be aware that both of these things occur on both sides of the spinal cord, but we're just basically concentrating on one side of the spinal cord just for clarity. Notice that the same diagram, same circuit would be found on the other side and vice versa. Anything that's found over here would also be found over here. But here we're going to look at one of our preganglionic neuron. Its cell body is arising from that lateral gray horn. From there, we're going to have an axon that is going to be efferent, is going to leave the central nervous system via that ventral root. It's going to travel via the white ramus communicans into that sympathetic chain ganglion, where it will synapse on a ganglionic neuron, and the postganglionic fiber, in this case, is going to exit via a sympathetic nerve, and it's going to innervate visceral organs in the thoracic cavity. On the other hand, we could have, instead of going via the sympathetic nerves, these postganglionic fibers could instead travel through the gray ramus communicans to be distributed with nerves via the spinal nerves, and these will be innervating things in the body wall and so forth. So once again, we have our preganglionic neuron sending its axon via the ventral root through the white ramus communicans, where it will synapse on a ganglionic neuron. And in this case, that postganglionic fiber is going to go through the gray ramus communicans to join the spinal nerve. And note once again our divergence here. So we have an axon that's synapsing within the adjacent chain ganglia, but notice how some of these axons send collaterals to other ganglia within the sympathetic chain. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the collateral ganglia. And as we've said before, these are going to be anterior to the vertebral bodies. And these are going to be innervating organs within the abdominopelvic cavity. So we've got our three collateral ganglia. As you recall, we have our celiac ganglion are superior mesenteric and inferior mesenteric ganglion, which are found within that abdominal cavity. And what we'll notice is that they will receive axons that have passed through the chain ganglia, and they will pass through a sympathetic nerve to one of these collateral ganglia, and this will then innervate stuff in the abdominopelvic cavity. And originally in development, these were usually two masses that eventually fused, and they fused right in front of the vertebral column. So here is an example of some of our preganglionic neurons coming via the ventral roots, via the white ramus, but then they go right straight through that chain ganglion, and then they synapse in one of the collateral ganglia, and then from there we have our ganglionic neurons send their fibers out to their targets. Now we also have one more, and this is the adrenal medullae, and there's one on either side, and the adrenal gland has an adrenal medulla, which is the inner part, and the outer cortex, which is going to be an endocrine part. And we're going to see that this adrenal medulla is very interesting in that it is going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. And we know that these are also neurotransmitters. We also know them by the name adrenaline and noradrenaline. So when you think about sympathetic activation, you get that adrenaline rush. That's when you get that increased awareness and that increased energy. So the adrenal medullae both contain postganglionic, or I should say ganglionic neurons with very short postganglionic fibers or axons. And these are going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, but they don't release them onto a synapse. Instead, they release them directly into the bloodstream, and that's just like sounding the general alarm. That really wakens the whole body. And so, in effect, this is acting as a hormone. Now, here's a picture of it. Here we have the preganglionic fiber, basically using its same route. We go via the ventral root, through the white ramus here, through the chain ganglion, through a sympathetic nerve, passing a collateral ganglion, and onto the adrenal medulla. And here we have this very short little postganglionic fiber here, and basically that's going to release the adrenaline right into the bloodstream. All right, so as we've said, most of the fibers in the sympathetic nervous system, we've got preganglionic fibers that are short because they don't have very far to go. Most of them will synapse in those paravertebral ganglia, which are called the sympathetic chain ganglia. And then we have these fairly long postganglionic fibers, with the exception, obviously, of the adrenal medulla. Now, we've already said that we find the neurons, or I should say the nuclei, the visceral motor nuclei, in those lateral gray horns from T1 through L2. So we know that. And we know that their preganglionic fibers are going to travel through the ventral root and through the white ramus communicans to get to their sympathetic chain ganglion. All right, so as we've said, we've got lots of divergence. So one preganglionic fiber can synapse on a bunch of ganglionic neurons, typically around 32. And we've got these fibers interconnecting the sympathetic chain ganglia, and so each of these ganglia are going to innervate particular body segments. And you'll see that obviously the upper ones near the cervical region are going to innervate areas of the head and neck, and the lower ones down in the lower thoracic and lumbar regions will innervate lower structures. So the preganglionic neurons that synapse in our sympathetic chain ganglia will have their neurons, their ganglionic neurons, will then send their postganglionic fibers one of two places. We're either going to have the postganglionic neuron follow the gray ramus communicans to be distributed back out into the spinal nerves, in which case those postganglionic fibers will target visceral effectors that are in the body wall, head, neck, or limbs. Or we can have those postganglionic fibers enter a sympathetic nerve, and those will innervate structures in the thoracic cavity, but they will also innervate sweat glands as well as smooth muscle and superficial blood vessels. Now, the collateral ganglia, as we know, are going to have their preganglionic neurons, their preganglionic axons, will pass through the sympathetic chain ganglia and synapse on the ganglionic neurons within the collateral ganglia. Now, the preganglionic fibers that bypassed the chain ganglia and went on to innervate one of these collateral ganglia are called splanchnic nerves. And we have three splanchnic nerves that are formed by these preganglionic fibers. The ones that go to the celiac ganglion are called the greater splanchnic nerve. The ones that go to the superior mesenteric ganglion are called the lesser splanchnic nerve. And the ones that travel to the inferior mesenteric ganglion are called the lumbar splanchnic nerves. We will also see that we have some other nerves that are going to be postganglionic fibers that will innervate sacral and lumbar structures. Once again, so here we have our celiac ganglion, we have our greater splanchnic nerve, we have our superior mesenteric ganglion, our lesser splanchnic nerve, and then we have our inferior mesenteric ganglion and our lumbar splanchnic nerve. And sometimes these are called the sacral splanchnic nerve. So we've already talked a lot about the function of the sympathetic nervous system and the different areas, the different ganglia and where their targets are. We've talked about the fact that the collateral ganglia are going to be innervating structures throughout the abdominopelvic cavity. And when we think of what's in there, we have things like digestive organs, urinary organs, reproductive organs. And these are not essential to short-term survival. So what's going to happen is that these functions will be slowed down. So the sympathetic division is basically going to slow these organs down. Basically, they're not going to be doing anything for us right now. So another thing that the sympathetic division is going to do is release our energy stores. So adipose stores that we might have, glycogen stores that are in the liver can be released so that we can use them and so forth. Now, of course, we will also talk about the adrenal medulla. Sometimes it's called neuroendocrine cells because these literally are neurons that are releasing neurotransmitter as a hormone. And this, as we've said before, sounds the general alarm in the body. So we've got epinephrine and norepinephrine that can basically go anywhere in the body where there is an epinephrine receptor. And we call these adrenergic receptors because they are going to be found anywhere throughout the body. They're going to be found all throughout the body, and basically they're going to respond to epinephrine or norepinephrine, which is going to increase metabolism and this kind of thing. So it's basically going to put the body into high gear. But the thing about this, these receptors are not at synapses. They're just all over the body, and this hormone, this neurotransmitter now traveling through the bloodstream and acting as a hormone, can now activate these cells without a direct synaptic innervation. All right, so the reason that this is important is that once the adrenal medulla starts releasing these hormones, then they become available for long periods of time. It's not just going to be released at a synaptic cleft when there's stimulation. Once the hormones, the neurotransmitters, have been released as hormones in the bloodstream, then these things can be in circulation for quite some time. So it's going to take a little bit longer for the hormones to diffuse out of the bloodstream, so the effects are longer lasting. So this is what's going to wake you up and ramp you up to make you able to meet the threat. All right, so we've already discussed what the sympathetic system does. It's going to increase your alertness. A lot of times it's going to increase energy and sometimes bring on a sense of euphoria. This is why a lot of people seek high stimulation, high energy situations and danger, because they'll get that euphoria. We've probably all heard of runner's high. You probably have seen the people who do the wingsuit jumps through all the really, really low level, 100 feet off the ground at 100 miles an hour, and then pull their chutes when they get out of the mountains. Well, this brings on a sense of euphoria because you're really igniting the sympathetic division. Your breathing is going to increase so that you can bring more oxygen. There's going to be an elevation in muscle tone. And as we've said many times before, there's going to be a mobilization of energy reserves. So you're going to be using up glycogen, and you're going to be using your sugars and your lipids pretty quickly. Now, we've got stimulation, obviously synaptic stimulation, between the preganglionic neurons and the ganglionic neurons. And all sympathetic preganglionic neurons are going to release acetylcholine. And that acetylcholine will then have an effect on the ganglionic neurons. We will see that this is the same in the parasympathetic division as well. So all preganglionic neurons are going to release acetylcholine. And they are going to be releasing acetylcholine on synapses that are very similar to what we've seen in other places, like the neuromuscular junction. At the other side of that synapse, so on the target cell, we are going to have a ligand-gated receptor. And so what's going to happen is the acetylcholine will bind with that receptor. In this case, it's going to open sodium channels. So this particular type of receptor is called nicotinic. The reason it's called nicotinic is because nicotine can also open the receptor and activate it just as acetylcholine can. So we call these nicotinic cholinergic synapses because the synapses are operated by acetylcholine. And we also have some other things, other substances that can mimic it and can also open these channels. And so we call these nicotinic cholinergic synapses. So all autonomic nervous system, both sympathetic and parasympathetic, preganglionic neurons are going to release acetylcholine, and that will have an effect on the ganglionic neurons. And those ganglionic neurons will have these ligand-gated sodium channels that are opened by acetylcholine. So once again, they're called nicotinic cholinergic synapses. Now the ganglionic neurons, on the other hand, are going to release neurotransmitters at their specific target organ. And we will see that in the sympathetic division, the set of neurotransmitters is different from what it is in the parasympathetic division. So let's talk a little bit first about what goes on in the sympathetic division. We have a variety of neurotransmitters that can be released, but the main ones are epinephrine and norepinephrine. As we've seen before, these are released by the medulla, the adrenal medulla as well. So these are typically the types of neurotransmitters that we will see. There are some others. In some synapses, we'll see acetylcholine can be released at some synapses, and we'll even have nitric oxide being released, which, as you recall, is a dissolved gas. So when we look at the ganglionic neurons, their postganglionic fibers are going to innervate their targets. And when we look at especially when we look at what we call adrenergic synapses, we're going to see that we have the telodendria, instead of ending in synaptic terminals, they'll form these like chains of tissue that looks like strings on a pearl, or pearls on a string, I mean. And these telodendria are going to create these things called virgosities, which are just swellings. And this is just going to be like pearls on a string. And so we're going to have the neurotransmitter inside vesicles along these things. And we will find that the effectors that they're going to innervate, they're going to wrap around these effectors. And there's not going to be a specialized postsynaptic membrane, but they're going to be receptors scattered all along the surface of the target cells. So it looks something like this. Here's our ganglionic neuron. And usually our postganglionic fiber is going to be unmyelinated, as you recall, whereas our preganglionic fiber is myelinated. So here we have our postganglionic unmyelinated fibers. And in this case, it's going to innervate some smooth muscle here. And we see that instead of having a distinct synaptic terminal, what we have are a bunch of these little varicosities, like pearls on a string. And we've got our norepinephrine packed inside of these vesicles here. And when this action potential comes down the postganglionic fiber, it's going to cause the release of our norepinephrine from these little vesicles here. And the receptors for it will be scattered all over these smooth muscles. So since adrenaline and epinephrine are synonyms, then any synapse where norepinephrine is released is called an adrenergic synapse, and the neurons that release the norepinephrine are called adrenergic neurons. Now we will see that all the targets, these effectors that are going to be affected by these postganglionic neurons, are going to have one thing in common. It does not even matter which part of the autonomic nervous system they are. We're going to have adrenergic neurons within the sympathetic division. We're also going to have a few cholinergic neurons within the sympathetic division. And we will find that all of these, the receptors, regardless of what the neurotransmitter is that stimulates the receptors will all be second messenger systems. So instead of having a ligand-gated channel or something to that effect, we're going to have second messengers. We will find that this is true in the parasympathetic division as well. The other important distinction between the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system is that while the sympathetic nervous system uses mainly norepinephrine, some acetylcholine, and sometimes nitric oxide as the postganglionic neuron, the thing that is released by the postganglionic neuron on the target, on the effector. In the parasympathetic division, that neurotransmitter will always be acetylcholine. And so that's an important distinction. But in either case, these receptors that are going to be on the effectors, on the targets, are going to be second messenger systems. So we're not going to use the typical ligand-gated channels that we had seen before.